All right. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2024 Choose Clean Water Coalition Conference Kickoff, a watershed moment, Chesapeake Bay Restoration Beyond 2025. Yeah, let's give it a clap. Yeah. Oh, thanks. So we added these half-day discussions a few years ago, and they've been extremely popular. The first year we talked about microplastics, last year we talked about solar siting, and this year is Beyond 2025. We had over 160 people register for the kickoff today, which I think demonstrates how much people are interested in and care about the future of the effort Beyond 2025. I know many organizations, including the Coalition, are having internal discussions on their vision for the future of the effort, and today we'll be talking about the proposed vision from the Chesapeake Bay Program. This is very much a working session, so let's get stretched out, everybody get energized. We're moving around, we're gonna be doing stuff. We have structured this kickoff to be conversational, to ensure we are hearing from different perspectives, and most importantly, that we are hearing from the stakeholders. This session is an official part of the Bay Program's public engagement strategy and is really an opportunity to hear from the folks on the ground in the community, working in the communities across the watershed. This is not a time to be shy. It is our opportunity to bring your ideas and expertise forward. So like I said, get ready to engage. Not multitasking today. We're doing it, right? As many of you have learned during our Back to the Future webinar series, this restoration effort has been going on for a long time, with many different commitments and agreements made along the way. The Bay Program is currently operating under the 2014 agreement, copies of which are located on your tables. You'll see some of them that have the Bay Program. Chris, can you hold that one up? Chris Williams? There you go. There, that one, thank you. 2014 agreement. And it's also via the link in the digital agenda that I sent you guys last week. So there's lots of digital links in there if you guys don't have the paper ones. This is the agreement we'll be focusing on today, which has 10 goals and 31 outcomes on your tables. That's the other handout you will see, which show the progress toward each of the, thank you, Vanna White, each of these goals and outcomes, and where they will be by the end of this year, end of 2025. And we can celebrate some great wins. When you look in there, you'll see that we are set to achieve outcomes on public access, on land use and fisheries, and that's amazing. But we are also off track on some of the outcomes as well. And this session will be an important opportunity to reflect on both those wins and where we need to adjust in order to be successful in the future. With that, I want to introduce our moderator for today, Laura Lutz. There she is. She's the editor-in-chief of the Bay Journal, a publication you might be familiar with. And we appreciate Laura taking the time to lead us through these conversations today. To ground our conversations for the rest of the day, we are starting with a conversation among several leaders for the Chesapeake Bay right now. Martha Shimkin, Director, EPA Chesapeake Bay Program. Jill Whitcomb, Director, Bureau of Watershed Restoration and Non-Point Source Management for Pennsylvania DEP. Kristen Saunders, who is the cross-program coordinator for UMCES, and Mariah Davis, the Environmental Justice Officer, Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and somebody that maybe worked for the Coalition at one point. So I'd like to invite these lovely women up to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm thrilled to see so many people are interested in being a part of the conversations that are going to take place today. I know all of you play a very big role in making your own local watersheds healthy, and that is just as important as the regional conversation because, as we know, it's all connected. So let's get started. We have a wonderful selection of panelists here to share their thoughts with us today. And I thought before we get into our main questions, we'd just do a little bit more by way of introduction. Maybe we'll just start with Mariah. Tell us a little bit about your work. And if you care to, I'd be very curious what inspires you. This is hard work, it's important work, exciting work, rewarding work, but it is hard. So what keeps you going? Or what got you into it? Sure, and I think those, we can remove the mics from the stand if it's easier. I can pass them. Or just move the whole stand if you like.
Sure.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here amongst friends and colleagues. I'm Mariah Davis. I'm the Environmental Justice Officer with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. So in my role, I was hired to be an advisor to the Secretary of Natural Resources. His name is Secretary Josh Kurtz. You'll hear more about him tomorrow. He'll be here. What inspires me I love being outside. I got into this work because that's where me and my family spent a lot of time outside. But I actually never learned about environmental justice in my academics, where I went to school. I only started to learn about it when I got actually involved in doing advocacy with a lot of you who are here in the room today. So that's something that's really important to me, not only professionally, but personally.
And I feel like I'm sitting at my kitchen table because half the people in this room I've grown up with in this career. So I'm Kristen Saunders, but the other half I haven't met. I'm with the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science as the cross-program coordinator at the Bay Program. So my job is to really try to connect the work across the disciplines in the program and make sure that people are connecting with each other, figuring out how to make all the pieces match and amplify the work as we go forward. What inspires me, I grew up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland on the Chester River. I don't have webbed feet, but I was only allowed to wear red toenail polish in the summer because the sediment and the soils that were at the bottom of the river would turn your toenails black, which was my first water experience, right, as a little kid. And grew up in state service. I've been now in the state of Maryland in some capacity for the last 35 years. And I was involved in the original 2009 negotiations for the 2014 agreement. So I have some of that historical perspective to bring to the table from the land conservation and people side of things. I didn't come up through the water side. So the inspiration really comes from my childhood and loving the people that I do this work with every day.
Hi, I'm Martha Shimkin. I'm the director of the Chesapeake Bay Program office and work for EPA in that function. So that's a program office that is charged with leading the partnership and working with all kinds of partners to do that. Within our office, we have 30 EPA employees. We have about, I haven't counted lately, but maybe 30 other federal agency employees, maybe a few more. Grantees and contractors. So we have an office of about 115 people, 30 of whom work for me, and the others are really excellent partners. And then we work across the 7 jurisdictions that are involved in the watershed. We work with non-governmental organizations and academic organizations, just individuals, and just really try and communicate the message. We have a great communications team as part of our grantee group within the office, and also chair the management board and represent federal agencies at our executive council for the partnership. So huge undertaking, you're right, it's a lot. It's a huge effort, so many dedicated people. And I guess what I would say inspires me on that is I've worked at EPA for many years. When I first started as a junior budget analyst many years ago, already we were awed by the Chesapeake Bay Program office. Like everybody was awed by the Chesapeake Bay Program, like that's the place. And so I had never set that as my goal to make it to the Chesapeake Bay Program office, but here I am, and I'm mostly inspired by the thousands of dedicated people, those in my office, but those across the whole watershed who really care. As Dr. Larry Sanders said at a meeting last week, I really care about this place, and I think everybody really cares about that place, and so it's so inspiring and worth the hard work.
Thank you, Martha. I'm Jill Whitcomb. I am the director of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Bureau of Watershed Restoration and Non-Point Source Management.
Catch your breath.
So the background to that is we've gone through about 3 reorganizations, starting in 2016 when the Chesapeake Bay office was first formed. There were 4 staff as part of that to help coordinate and support and lead Pennsylvania's Chesapeake Bay efforts. In 2020, during COVID, the non-point source side of the house, our statewide conservation district support and our agriculture compliance and our EPA Section 319 and Growing Greener programs were pulled up underneath the Chesapeake Bay office. And then in 2022, finally fully reorganized, and the hierarchy came about where we have now a full-fledged division focused on Chesapeake Bay watershed restoration efforts in Pennsylvania, and a division focused on our statewide non-point source program. So with that, lots of change, lots of growth. I personally enjoy change. I know not everyone does. I know change can be scary. But I think when it comes to what inspires me, the opportunity for change, the opportunity for effective and efficient utilization of our programs and of our policies, and also the direct interaction that we get to have on the ground with our local stakeholders, our conservation districts. My background includes working for a conservation district as an ag technician, working directly with farmers and landowners and other organizations to improve, restore, and protect water quality, but also to improve the community and the health of their waters and their backyards and sustainable agriculture. So I think that's really what inspires me, is people like you and people that we get to work with day in and day out on the ground that get the work done. So thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks to all of you. And I guess a quick introduction for myself. I am Laura Lutz. I'm the editor of the Chesapeake Bay Journal, and I hope that most people in the room know the Bay Journal. But knowing that we don't have much of a marketing budget, I will make a little plug here that we are a nonprofit news organization that has been reporting on environmental issues in the Bay Watershed for over 30 years. We're the only news outlet that is dedicated to the environment in the Bay region, and we're pretty proud of that. We are a nonprofit organization, so we share the pains and struggles that a lot of you folks do. But we share our content for free use by other news media throughout the region, which has been important as other newsrooms are shrinking. So if you have a local paper that doesn't have much resources but has readers that are interested in environmental issues, call your editor, tell them to call us. And if you don't know us, please know that our subscriptions are free. You can get it digitally or in print. And you should sign up at bayjournal.com, check out our podcast, our videos, and join the Bay Journal community of readers, if you will. So to move back to our panel here, yeah, huge work, huge topics, and we figured about 25 minutes. So here we go. To start with what is fairly obvious, I think, to all of us, that there has been an enormous amount of time, thought, talent, science, money put into the Bay restoration effort for decades, and especially since the 2014 Bay Agreement. And we know that there's been progress. In fact, every Bay Agreement in all their different forms has motivated progress. And when we kind of get to the end of the cycle one, we go, we made progress, but there's still work to do. And we know that will always be the case because this is an unending job. But in particular, since 2014, some of the successes, which I'm sure we'll touch on today, we hear a lot about the oyster reef restoration work, is celebrating some successes. Land conservation, blue crab management, lots of great work going on at the local level. There have been steps forward in DEIJ, lots more to be done there. But there are some of the biggest ecosystem pieces, like nutrient reductions for water quality, forest buffers, wetlands, they're all still struggling. So I think what's happening here as we're talking about what happens beyond 2025, especially looking at nutrient reduction, what needs to change so that we can start moving the needle? And then on top of that, last year, you may remember, there is a report released, which is called for short the CSER report, which is looking at the system response of the Chesapeake ecosystem. It was from the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee of the Chesapeake Bay Program. And they really tried to tackle tough issues about why we aren't seeing the ecosystem response that we had predicted, looking at gaps still in our scientific knowledge, the complexity of the ecosystem, and asking whether we might need to look at some different strategies. So all these things are layered together, and it's really hard to figure out what the takeaways are as in terms of where the restoration effort is and where it's going next. So we need your help to help make sense of this. And we're going to take a real high-level overview on this now. Think about 20 years, no small thing, right? But reflecting on what you've seen happen in the wake of the 2014 agreement, which of course is still in place, what stands out to you? And that might be either what's been achieved or what's been not achieved. But if you could pick one or two things out that you'd like the audience to think about, what might they be? Martha, can I start with you? Sure.
She didn't say she was going to call on us.
I have to pick somebody.
That's fine. Sure. So the things that stand out for me, kind of three key messages. The partnership is strong. We have done a lot. I want to say it this way. The accomplishments are great, and there's a lot more to do. So just a little bit on each of those. This partnership that has bound together over now, it started smaller, but now 6 states, Washington, D.C., the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and federal agencies represented by EPA at meetings, but representing themselves at other meetings, have stuck together and built this and worked together and brought top-level capabilities, science, expertise, and dedication to keep us going, to look ahead, to plan, and to implement. And so the partnership is strong, and it's really important to our success. So much has been accomplished, and Laura already listed things, so I don't know that I want to keep the list going or repeat it, but a couple things not mentioned. The wastewater treatment is incredible when we look at the difference, and stormwater management wasn't even a thing, I think, when we started, or wasn't as much of a thing. Maybe some were involved, but just I spent this morning actually with EcoWorks with Lori, yeah, there she is, with really, really great site visit, because I was in Ellicott City anyway. The amount of work that's getting done at the most local level and then across the board at our governor's level and administrators, there is a lot that has been done. And then there's a lot more to do. And we've heard that from that Caesar report that Laura just mentioned, and other technical reports in our own experience. There is a lot to do, and that's what's before us now. It's an awesome opportunity, and it's a huge responsibility.
Sure. I think some things that we've been really successful at, you mentioned, our blue crab numbers and our oyster numbers. DNR recently released a report, our annual oyster report, and oysters are looking great. I think it's really important that we continue to protect, our habitats and these ecosystems that are really vital to us, not from an economic standpoint, but also from a cultural standpoint. So I'm very pleased to see those outcomes have been a really great success. Some areas I think for improvement, or at least to kind of lean into as we move forward beyond 2025. Maryland, we haven't met all of our water quality goals, but we're working on it. We still have a lot of challenges when it comes to agriculture and non-point source pollution, but we're very committed and on track. Public access, I think we have a real opportunity to rethink the way in which we, see people and how they interact with our environment. It's great to continue opening up, sources to waterways and boat ramps and things like that. But just because we open up a waterway or a boat ramp doesn't mean that people are actually going to go there and they're actually going to recreate, especially when we look at the watershed and the majority of it being agriculture and land-based. I think we really need to do some reworking and thinking about how we're thinking about access and recreational opportunities, especially for people who have been marginalized and left behind and out of those conversations. And I'll continue to say this throughout the panel because I think it's important and it's not embedded in our agreement, but this country was built on racism, and that continues to show up in our environmental policy and our environmental decision making. I'm really proud of the work that the state has done to invest in some of our beaches that have been segregated and things like that. But I think it's really important that we take those lessons into how are we, continuing to look forward, especially as we continue to embed diversity, equity, inclusion in this work. Because if you look around the room, there's a lot of people who are left out of this conversation, but I think we have a real opportunity to continue opening up those spaces and making them more inclusive and equitable.
Jill, and then we'll come to you, Kristen.
Thank you. So I'll add two things. I think in the last 10 years, culture shifts. So there's been a significant culture shift, at least in Pennsylvania, since 2014 and even in the last 5 years or so, where we have seen that a top-down approach does not work. It is not a functional approach to getting anything accomplished. We have to have that local stakeholder buy-in. Most of our watershed is privately owned, And so we have to engage with our landowners. And I say have to, not in a way that is a negative, but in a way that is a positive. There's no going about doing anything without engaging our local landowners and local leaders. And secondly is that there's been some significant technological advances in the last 10 years. Just think about 2014 and where we were then with GIS, with mapping and those types of things. Now there's opportunities here. We're seeing folks like the Chesapeake Conservancy working directly and very closely with our county leaders and local organizations on precision conservation and using geospatial technology and databases to really harness those advances. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to utilize those advances moving forward and being on the front end versus trying to catch up to where the world is going.
Thank you. Kristen?
Last but not least.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, I've been reflecting, listening to the other three. I like going after these three, actually, because I can pick off of different things that I've heard. And going back to the original question, Laura, I think, we've spent some time within the program looking across the time that we've been doing this work, not just back to 2014, but before that, and trying to tease out the lessons that we've learned as to what makes it work and what makes it not work so great. And in preparation for the biennial meeting that we had last year in March, we were able to put together a synthesis of things that really seem to work in unison to elevate the work and amplify the work and make it successful. And I refer to it lovingly as the secret sauce. If you guys have heard me in staff meetings, I talk about what's the secret sauce. Let's try to tease out the elements of that recipe. And it's interesting to note that the secret sauce, we were able to really dig into the huge successes, and you listed a few of them: land conservation, oysters, stream restoration, fish passage, fish habitat. None of those things are regulatory in their control. I mean, they have regulatory aspects to the work that you do, but it wasn't a regulatory program that made those successful. It was the partnership efforts that made those successful. It was having a specific goal in mind, a numeric goal in most cases. Not all of our outcomes have strict numeric goals yet, but they're working on that. We recognized that when we drafted the agreement in 2014. And I think looking at that recipe for success, having champions at the executive council, principal staff committee, management board, and goal implementation team, and within each jurisdiction, is a really important component. If you're missing one of those layers, if you're missing a lever in some way, shape, or form, you're not going to see the successes that we've seen in some of these other outcomes that have really just gone on and done great things. I think the other things that we've seen are to have funding aligned at the local, state, and federal level with nonprofit partners and private financing coming in to the sides also makes it really possible to achieve those goals that we have set. Making sure that there is a champion. It's good to have the alignment from the Fed on down to the local level, but if you don't have a champion who's constantly at the table reminding people, hey, you committed to this other thing too, it's not likely to be raised in the context of what the discussion is. So I think we have a success that we can look at in several of the outcomes. We can look at that secret sauce recipe and then apply it to the things like Jill was just talking about. We know that there are land use changes happening at an exponential rate. We know that there are issues with non-point source that we need to address, both in agriculture and in the stormwater arena. We know that a lot of these changes are going to require changes in behavior of how people view it, whether they're an individual private property owner, or if they're a consortium of people, if they're a community that's an environmental justice community that is trying to change the trajectory of where their community is headed in terms of healthy and supportive of their needs. There are a lot of things that we can do to bring the secret sauce forward to address some of these other issues. And I think it is going to take some innovation. It's going to take creativity and a willingness to change, as Jill talked about. But we do have some really clear signals of what we can do with the existing agreement, or if we're going to amend the agreement, whatever we end up deciding, the steering committee is looking at that right now. But to be able to deploy that secret sauce for the other things that we have not been successful in. I think population growth is another one that we really need to be keeping our eyes on. We tend to look at the Bay program in terms of water quality and the other outcomes, and what do we do to move those things forward? And you can go outcome by outcome. Some people are very myopic and they're just focused on one particular discipline. Others are focused on a bigger picture. But we need a systemic approach. We need a systems approach to this work if we're gonna succeed, because you can put all the BMPs in the ground in one place, but if you're still clearing trees, or you're doing solar siting and you're eliminating agricultural land that otherwise would be growing food for people, then you're not really moving the needle. You're just barely holding the line. So I think, one thing I would love to see happen as we go forward is to make sure that we're checking ourselves on that holistic approach and looking at all of the pieces, all the component parts. And maybe the agreement, takes us in a direction of there are levers that we can affect change in. There's information that we can share with people who we may not at the state level have the ability to make decisions on land use planning permits. The locals do. Well, let's give them the benefit of all the technology and the information and the data and the targeting that we can share with them to make good land use decisions. And the same with private property owners. So I think it's completely achievable. We have a track record of success that we could be building on and should be building on, and I think that there are definitely some signals of where we can go to accelerate that work moving forward in the next several years.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you. I'd like to stay on that topic of lessons learned, because you just gave us a whole handful there to think about. But I mean, moving forward, we are, while acknowledging progress, asking about what we can do better. So I think, kind of the crux of it for me is always what needs to change and by how much. So I'd like to hear from the other panelists on this idea of lessons learned. Is there something you see that we should definitely be carrying forward and applying, sort of as Kristen was suggesting? Or lessons learned as in, we tried this, it might not have been the best foot forward, we're learning from it, we need to let it go and do something differently. Is there anyone who wants to tackle that for us? Jill?
So I think that there's definitely lots of lessons learned and lots of things that we're kind of testing out. I think one of the things that we've seen is we can have all the data and tools we want, but unless they're made to be useful and meaningful to the organizations and the entities that are the audience for those data and tools, it's not worth the time. So I think we need to really take on an opportunity for either consolidating or connecting the plethora of information and tools that are made available and put it into a more user-friendly system. And I like what Kristen noted about systems approach and making those connections, as opposed to looking at things in silos and saying, well, this is for clean water, this is for water quality, or this is for, land conservation, or this is for whatever. How can we kind of match those things up and help our organization say, well, if I want to do all 10 of these things, where should I focus? How do I start? And I think we're getting there. I think that there's definitely been a start on that, but really putting more emphasis in on making things more useful for the audience is really essential. And I also liked what Kristen noted about champions. And I think champions come from everywhere, right? There's not just a champion, we need to think about leadership in a way that isn't just at the executive level. But leadership that happens everywhere. It could be a landowner that is doing work on their farm and working directly and very closely with their neighboring, with their neighbors, or it could be a township manager that is, looking at doing something for their community and working closely with their watershed organization. So I want to make sure that leaders come in many forms, and we need to have as many champions for these things as possible. So I'm glad to see all of you here today to talk about that. And then thirdly is, and as importantly, people are motivated by success. They're not, generally speaking, I don't know if I'm only speaking from my perspective, but as a child, I wasn't motivated by failure. I think many folks are motivated by doing more when they are seeing that what they are doing, what they're spending their time on, what they're spending their resources on is successfully leading to something, leading to some kind of result. And whether it's, locally in their own communities or whether it's in the Chesapeake Bay itself, I think just leaning in on sharing those successes and being more conscientious about how we change behavior and how we get folks to continue to do this work out there on the ground. And so those are some of the things that I would like to see, lessons learned moving forward and continuing to build upon those.
Thank you.
I think people are motivated by success, but one thing I really appreciate about the next generation and the younger generation is that they continue to push us to be better, and they continue to ensure that we're being accountable. If you take a look at what's going on in the country, we're at odds, we're in disagreement about a lot of things, and I think that's one thing that actually really makes this partnership so successful is that there are a diversity of opinions, and it's important that we make space because everybody has different needs, everybody has different capacities, everybody looks different. We're all serving different constituencies and different people. So I think it's important that we continue to foster a culture where there is disagreement, but also a culture within the partnership where people feel heard and they feel like they can be listened to and they feel like they can be empowered. The partnership includes a lot of different people, all of you that are here in the room, but it also includes businesses and a lot of local people and local leaders, as you all spoke to. I think one of the biggest challenges and opportunities and also a weakness of our partnership is how the agreement was set up. We have a big vision, it's very broad, a bunch of outcomes and goals. We're only really tied to one of them that's non-voluntary, and then we have 30 other outcomes that we have to achieve. So I think it's really important as we continue to go forward that we see where we are, assess, reassess, and also make room for amendments or for changes and to see where we can be improving and doing better. Kristen touched a bit on challenges with development, but also climate change. I think that really needs to be at the center as we continue to move forward in these conversations about, what are we doing beyond 2025? Flooding and issues of climate change are not slowing down in any way, shape, or form. One thing I also just want to note, and it's something that gets left out of a lot of these conversations, is when it comes to climate change, it's driven by the fossil fuel industry. And although we're the Bay Program and the Bay Partnership, and we're not focused on fossil fuels, that still has a huge impact on our airshed and on our air quality. So I think it's really important that we're really taking into consideration how people of color and brown communities are most impacted by the fossil fuel industry, and also how water quality is being impacted too. I think that those conversations actually needs to come more so to the forefront and in the same conversations, and we continue to keep them separate. And if we continue to keep them separate, you're going to continue to leave people behind. But I think that's a huge lesson learned and an opportunity in a growth area that we have in our partnership.
Thanks, Mariah.
So to not repeat, because everything I've heard I think are really good responses as well, but if I think of lessons learned and a couple of things that are out there to really emphasize, I didn't write down the name of it, so Rachel, if you want to tell, but there is a report put together by the partnership, really led by Noah and by Rachel and by a drafting committee, on looking at what we committed to in the 2014 agreement and what had been achieved, and the we is the big partnership, right? What had been achieved and what are lessons learned from that, and where do we need to really lean in that we're not giving up. We still have this agreement. We will continue working on it. And Rachel, what's the name of that report people can find? Charting a course to 2025. So that is up and available for people to read. And I know, while I don't remember the name, I have a printed out copy on my desk and I refer to it. Like, let's not forget, we have a lot of work before us right now. And in the office that I lead, I've prioritized wetlands. What can we do on wetlands? Let's put together a strategy on wetlands. Non-point sources, it's a huge thing. Jill mentioned that we need to look at non-point sources and novel ways to address them. And just wetlands, forest buffers, right, Katie? I saw Katie somewhere. And really looking at forest buffers and urban tree canopies. Those are areas that we need to be investing in now. They're ones that we actually, the principal staff committee highlighted to the executive committee last fall. So those, and then Anna and I will have a chance to share a little more, but just remembering that this is for the people. People are agents of change. The people do the work, and ultimately the people are the ones who enjoy the environment around us. So keeping people in the mix. We mentioned climate change, and there's one other the other thing I wanted to mention. Okay, so we mentioned climate change, but then another document out there that Laura started with mentioning is the Caesar report, and how important it is that this group of over 60 scientists spent 5 years looking at evaluating what has worked, why haven't we gotten the full bang for the buck, what more needs to be done, and making recommendations. Not necessarily a roadmap, not a prescription, a lot of food for thought. And that is definitely a lessons learned document.
Thank you. Good to point to that. I want to ask a question here about goal setting, because we know that we're looking hard at the goals that are in the 2014 agreement, and we're asking how much change should there be? Is it doubling down with what we've got? Do we need to look at them again? And there's goals and outcomes, which I know in that document are two separate things. The goals are the more overarching bucket of topics, and the outcomes, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in that document the lingo is that the outcomes are the measurable pieces that support the goals, correct? Okay, so what I'm hearing in part as a theme from all of you is an even deeper respect for the complexity and connectivity of this effort, not only to other parts within the Bay restoration effort, but also with things like economics, population growth, the fuel industry, right? So on the one hand, I hear we need to grapple with this in an even more complex way. But I also hear, not on the panel, but in the broader regional conversation, about the need to simplify and double down on some of the things that we're not making enough progress on. Now, I know I'm not asking you how we do this moving forward, but in general, do any of you have any thoughts on how you reconcile a goal-setting process with so many moving pieces? Like, do we need to look again at really how far in the future can we set goals? How measurable are some of them when we know that some of the goals like didn't account for climate change at the beginning? Maybe we should have backed up and done that sooner, amended the agreement. I mean, what kind of framework can help us navigate this kind of complexity and changing elements?
I think there's a lot of different ways that we can be looking at this, but it really is a strategic plan almost. We need to be developing smart, achievable, measurable goals. And when the Bay Agreement was put together, it was very ambitious. And ambition is okay. But again, I think, when we're going to start to really think about, proposing an amendment, it's important that we continue to reassess and look at what have we been really successful at, but also be really critical of ourselves to say, where do we need to make progress and where can we improve? And I think there's a lot of different ways in which you can look at an amendment, and I'd love to hear from you all and what you think about that. But even when it comes to water quality, okay, we've met our nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment goals, but now what? what else do we need? Because this is long-term. We're a family, the bay isn't gonna get cleaned up this year or next year, but it's really a long-term commitment. So whether it's, taking a look to say, okay, do you need technical assistance? What do you need to further those goals? I think are really important. So it's important that we're nimble and we're flexible and that we're applying adaptive management to these things. And again, that we're focusing and listening to all of our different needs and all of our different perspectives, because it's gonna look different based on which jurisdiction that you're coming from.
Want me to go next? Okay. It is a tricky thing, right? To think about this tension and having been involved in the Bay Program since 2009, there has been this constant tension. And do you simplify, streamline? Do you make it more complex to be more inclusive? I think what we've got in the 2014 agreement is sort of a mix of the result of those conversations. I think to answer your question about a framework, I always start from the vision. The vision statement that's in the agreement was very intentionally crafted. It was probably not perfect, right? I mean, we can look at any part of that document now and say, oh, I wish I had thought about climate change or included something else. But it was written in a way that can be changed over time to adapt as we see fit, which is great. I mean, that was really great thinking that was put into the agreement language. You start with a vision, and the goals that flow from that are really intended to be the framework of achieving that vision, right? So you have a clean water goal, but you also have a stewardship goal. You have an environmental education outcome. Why do we have that? I sort of took a look at the agreement after the steering committee got started and thought to myself, well, if we were gonna streamline this or shrink it or make it less of a commitment, what would come out? And I've really wrestled with that question, because I know the intent behind including environmental literacy, for instance, was because we knew in order to make this vision durable, if you're going to do the work and repair, if you're gonna delist a stream, doesn't it serve your best interest to make sure that children who live near that creek understand their role in making sure that that stays in a clean state moving forward? The stewardship, the public access, the environmental literacy, a lot of those outcomes were incorporated into the agreement in order to give you the full complement of work to achieve not just the clean water, but to make sure that the clean water and the lands that we conserve and the habitat that is created through restoration efforts live into perpetuity in the future. And yes, they have to be adaptable for climate change, they have to be adaptable for human impact, whether it's development, deforestation, whatever it is, that you have that full complement of work going on. So I think it is a challenge to try to think about how you make this agreement smaller or less commitments within it. If you're going to go full spectrum on, let's just make it about water quality. I mean, that's one end of the extreme on the spectrum. And if you achieve water quality, and this was a question I remember coming up many, many years ago, if it's just the water quality that we go for, what do you end up with at the end of the day? You have clean water, but it's just one factor of the habitat that you need for sustaining living resources, right? It's just one piece. It's a factor that influences that habitat. So it's not enough to do just one, but we also don't want to be in a competition. And I've heard Jill talk about this on panels before, and I love when she says this, because we don't want to be in competition with each other. It takes everybody in the room and all of the different partners to come together to serve up the fabulous buffet, right, of the full complement of the vision. It takes everybody. So I think part of the looking at the agreement moving forward could include looking at that recipe, the secret sauce recipe. Do we have the outcomes that are defined in a way that they're all loaded with champions and dedicated funding and have support and policy that's aligned at all levels? If not, can we fix those things, as opposed to taking them out of the agreement because it's too hard? I think another thing that we can think about is reframing the way that some of the outcomes are specified in the agreement. There are some in there that are really indicators of the system health, but they were put in there specifically because it allowed certain federal agencies, for instance, to be at the table that otherwise wouldn't be there. So there are some outcomes that are specific to fish and wildlife priorities. There are some that are NOAA priorities. If you take those out, the potential unintended consequences, the partner who's doing that work and amplifying your work takes their ball and goes home, and they take their money and go home. And then suddenly you're doing this thing all by yourself as opposed to having your friends help you put on a really great buffet style potluck dinner. So I think that's the mental exercise that we all need to go through, is how do we keep all the component parts to meet the vision, and how do we do it in a way that we don't lose anybody and we actually gain people? We need to open up, as Mariah said. You want to bring more people in and be inclusive of those who are not at the table right now. And in order to do that, it's going to be more complex.
Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate you guys tackling that. To keep us on track, I'm going to move ahead, but we will start at the far end of the table. As a closing question, I'm curious to hear from each of you. Maybe we'll just work our way from Jill over to Mariah. What are the top issues that you would like to see the partnership address as we talk about beyond 2025?
All right, thank you. So top issue for me is the process, the complexity of the nature of the partnership. And I think Kristen was, and Mariah, what they were saying, and what I'm going to share is very much tied to what they had to say about, well, what could we take out? Well, in my mind, it's not the what, it's the how. We need to really focus in on the processes and the steps that it takes to go from point A to point Z. And if we could kind of clear a path, so to speak, so that it's easier. And everyone likes to talk about streamlining, but for what it's worth, do we need to have all of these things happening in order to demonstrate progress? In any one of these goals and outcomes. In some, we may need to hunker down and do more and have more focus on it. In others, they may be more apt to continuing what the states are already doing and allowing them to continue to do that work. So I think really it's going to come down to, I really like what Mariah said about a strategic plan. The agreement is very high level, in my opinion. It doesn't tell us how. It tells us what. It doesn't tell us how. So how do we go about drafting those strategic plans? And I know we have the logic and action plans, we have the SRS process, but those are very focused on the cohorts, right? How do we look at more high level process and procedure so that things don't get kind of bogged down in bureaucracy? And finally, I think just to highlight, other top issues as it relates to funding and as it relates to all the work that needs to get accomplished. I think driving home the point that 2025 is not the end. It's a point, it's a checkpoint along the way. The work that we're doing is going to be long-term, is going to be generations. I mean, this isn't something that just stops. So how do we set ourselves up for the next generation to come into this world and to come into this, sphere of conservation and of preservation and of clean water and habitat? How do we set those people up for success moving forward?
That's a great question to pose for us, Jill. Thanks. Martha?
All right, so we're a very science-based partnership. Science informs a lot of the decision-making. And in setting goals and looking at our agreement, that's an art as well. It is forward-looking, it needs to be inspiring and motivational, and it has to be somewhat doable, but not easy. And many times with strategic plans, we have to reevaluate and set new goals or amend the goals so that they're up to date with the times. But just because one doesn't get achieved on the time that was set doesn't mean it's a failure. And so I say that just in the art of strategic planning. It has to be a doable, feasible plan that's also politically savvy and inspirational, and that mix is an art. I think that when we look at complexity of our partnership now, I mean, it's huge. There are 18 million people who live in it and millions more who visit. It's across 64,000 square miles. It's not just in one location, and every one of those miles matters to the people who live there or visit there. So it's naturally going to be complex, and how do we tackle it all? I think so much of it gets tackled at the local level. I do think the existing agreement has addressed those things, and as what Jill was saying there, it's high level, but it's implementable at different levels. And so I think that we have a good agreement. It's well thought through. We know it needs updating. It needs to incorporate people and climate change and other issues, but it is a good guiding principle for us, and I think it's a very solid agreement that we can work on, and Anne and I will talk a little bit more about that at the next session.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to it, and I think we are in a good place looking at this and looking ahead, and yet there's still a lot more to do.
Thanks. Kristen? Shocker, I have a long list, but I'll try to be really fast. Okay, so these are the things that I think about almost every day with regard to the Bay Program. Being holistic, making sure that we're doing a balance of conservation and restoration, that we're focused in areas where we can target, where places are, where water and land meet and where people interact with the resource. And there's a lot of reference to the shallow water areas in the Caesar report, and I think in the steering committee recommendations there will be some references to that. But being able to show progress initially, targeting those areas, showing progress where people are interacting with the resource, where living resources will probably have the most quick turnaround. They talk about tipping points in Caesar. So to focus in those areas first, we can aim for the deep trench, but it doesn't have to be on the same timeline. We can start on the edges. So I think looking at edges, doing targeting, making sure we're taking advantage of all of this data and information, and grant you, I have this mantra of no new tools, because we develop tools, but they're really hard to use. We have a lot of really smart people who can explain them. So could we have conservation concierges or navigators, people who are out in the field, community liaisons who are working with local communities to identify what the community wants to see happen and translating that back into the things that we can do as environmental solutions to meet those community needs, like flooding, like fish consumption, like agricultural runoff, you name it, whatever it is. I think it would be really important to put the living resources and people on the front end of decision making for projects. This goes for climate, this goes for stream restoration. We've had stack workshops come out that say, if you do a stream restoration project and you don't think about uplifting the living resources, you're just gonna get clean water. But if you plan it with the intention of creating ecological uplift and having critters live there and having nature for communities that live in the proximity area be able to interact with it, that would be preferable. So putting living resources and people's needs on the front end of the decisions about where you do nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment intervention would take us really far, really quickly. And the last is to really, again, focus on this community need. A lot of people don't get involved in the Bay Program because they're like, I'm not worried about Bay restoration. I'm worried about the flooding in my backyard. Or I'm worried about my community that's losing its cultural resources, our cemeteries underwater. Well, guess what? We have some solutions that could work for communities like that. We're not approaching it that way. So we need to flip the conversation and translate the work that we do into things that matter to people on the ground, particularly in those communities that we don't engage with normally, and help them see a path where we can bring some services
and achieve our goals at the same time.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
My two big wish list things, the partnership and people, and I'll start with people since you started to
She
go
set
into
you
that.
up.
Yes, you did. Thank you. People. So when it comes to centering people, I talked about racism, I talked about Jim Crow, I talked about present day. You know, a lot of our parks were built on racism, and we still see that today. People do not feel welcomed in the outdoors, and I think, you know, even in this conversation today and beyond, there's a lot of audiences that we focus on. We focus on farmers, that's centering people. We focus on landowners, that's centering people. Municipalities, governments. We focused a lot of time and a lot of resources on that audience of people, but there's a lot of other people that are not here that we're not centering this work in and that we're not talking about. So that's what it means to center people, is to really think about who's not in the room, who are the most disadvantaged, who are the ones really being impacted by flooding, and figuring out, okay, how can we work together to provide some co-benefits? You've got trash in your community, you've got stormwater issues, we've got solutions, we've got technical assistance. So it's really a behavior change that we need to make. You know, we all have biases, and bias is not bad, bias is good, but it's important for us to understand our bias, and we have a lot of bias in this work. So we really need to be thinking about how are we centering people and not always thinking about, well, where are we gonna get the most bang for our buck? Partnership needs work. I don't know if you all know this, but we actually have principles of the partnership in the Bay Agreement. They're really great principles. They're focused on collaboration, operating with transparency, anticipating changing conditions, adaptive management, engaging the public, exploring social science, promoting environmental justice. I think we really need to have a conversation where we're thinking about the structure and how is it working most efficiently and effectively for everyone. I spend a lot of time on Zoom with all of you in this room, but we really need to think about our capacity. You know, we're here representing government and academia, and I think Jill said that her department started off with 5 people. That's a lot of people to be on these calls. So I think as we look to the future, we really need to think about the structure in which we're working most effectively and efficiently, but also in a way that's allowing for people who haven't been in these conversations to be in these conversations. So my 2 wish list items are partnership and people.
Thanks, Mariah. Well, I feel really lucky to have heard such thoughtful answers to these difficult questions, and I appreciate your time and patience as we worked our way through the conversation. I think at this point we can give our panelists a round of applause. And I'll invite Kristen to come forward, or Anna. We're going to go right. We're skipping right to the next part of this, where you're going to hear more from Martha and from Anna Killius about what recommendations are coming out of the Beyond 2025 effort.
So before I start, I want Anna to introduce herself, since I already had the chance.
Hello, everyone. Anna Killius, Executive Director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission and longtime attendee of these, wearing very different hats every couple of years, but maybe this one will stick for a while.
Excellent. So Anna and I are the co-chairs of the Planning Committee for Beyond 2025, and we are going to give a quick overview of that Planning Committee effort, so that in the next sessions you have that kind of background in case you haven't been involved in it. Yeah, it's a little hard to see and make sure that my page matches, but we're good. So Beyond 2025, I mentioned the what we call lovingly the Reaching 2025 report before, and that was a report kind of looking where we are and how we're doing in accomplishing the goals. The next part is the Beyond 2025, looking beyond 25. And why are we talking about reaching and beyond? It's because the current 2014 Watershed Agreement has a lot of goals, not all of them, but a lot of goals set for by 2025 we will. So this became our shorthand in talking about reaching and beyond 2025. So the Executive Council met in 2022, some time ago, and charged the partnership with coming up with a report on where do we stand, and that was submitted in 2023, and yes, in 2023, last fall. And then the next step was to recommend a path forward for beyond 2025. So as one of the panelists said before, the current agreement does not sunset. So it's not like, oh my gosh, we got to do something in a year and a half or we don't have an agreement. We still have that agreement, and there's a lot of expectation that partners will continue to lean in and provide robust effort and activity to make sure that we implement as much as possible. And I'll just say for a second, with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this program, the program that I manage, but really for the partnership, got an increase of almost $50 million a year. It's $238 million over 5 years, so it's like 47.6 million or something per year. And that was specifically to help us invest more, do more, lean in, and see more action on the goals that we have set before us. So to meet this charge from the Executive Council on planning beyond 2025, a steering group was set up. The management board set that steering group up, and that's what Anna and I are co-chairing. So as we do in the partnership, that is complex. It involves so many partners and so much space and so many requirements. We have a very large steering committee of 29 people. So I'm going to show you kind of quickly who's in that, but I thought let me just point out this is the charge. You probably can't see it from where you are, but there's this charge, and that's what I'm speaking to, is the beyond 2025 and planning ahead. Oh, we skipped that one, right? Yeah, so that's the charge. We skipped that one, yeah. Sorry, it's a little hard to see what we're presenting. So I'll just tell you that the steering committee consists of members from all the jurisdictional partners, from all the federal partners, from goal teams, from the commission, 2 non-governmental organizations that were kind of representative, and there are 29 total people on this steering committee. We have met monthly since, depending how you count, since about July, and we are putting together the recommendations to send before the management board and the principal staff committee, so that we're going to share the process for that. But so ultimately, recommendations to the executive council can be made in the meeting, the annual meeting this year, that I think will be taking place in December of this year. So far we, as a steering committee, were able to identify our product, which is, sounds easy, but it's not so easy. I like to say we have 29 members, and we have alternates, so there's like 58 people, and we probably have 100 good ideas every time we meet. But we did set forward a product to recommend the action on the agreement. What do we think should happen with the agreement, and on the partnership? How do we assess the partnership, and what changes need to be made? So that was what we set forward as our work before us. And then looking at the Caesar report, the forest buffer and wetland work group reports, rising temperature reports, and the Reaching 25 plus so much more, identified 5 key topics that we thought we really need to think about these before we can make a good recommendation. And so I'm going to get to those in a minute. We also wanted, in order to look at the partnership, we wanted someone independent to look at that for us, look at our forming documents, our foundational and government documents, and then talk with people. And so we hired a contractor to conduct that work, and we just got their report recently. So these 5 key topics that came up from the steering committee, but based on all the different walks of life and experience and dedication and years of service, these are the 5 key topics that we came up with. And we set up these small groups from the steering committee, small groups led by a steering committee member, and go find your members of your small group and look into this issue and come back with recommendations. So they were set out in October, and in February of this year, we had a 2-day symposium, and it was amazing, the work and effort that went into this. And I just comment on our ability to work hybrid and virtually now. We could not have done a brainstorming like this that went across the watershed. More than 1,000 people, I am sure, were involved in this, in helping provide the recommendations back to the steering committee to consider. And so these topics, clean water, climate change, healthy watersheds, people, and shallow water habitats were the topics that were considered. And the work of those small groups, while we've allowed them to be done. Everything was consolidated. Each recommendation, 5 per group, was consolidated into a page according to a format, and those will now be source material that will go forward with our recommendations, as well as influence what we're putting forward as a recommendation. And I just wanted to talk briefly about the process, and I'm going to hand it over to Anna. So we have the steering committee. You can see up here on this, this org chart here. And I mentioned who's on that. We meet monthly. We did have a little bit of a hiatus when those small groups were meeting, made up for the two-day meeting in Harrisburg in February, which was a lot of work. Actually, Governor Wes Moore videotaped a kind of inspirational message to the group before we got started. And we had 2 former leaders of the Chesapeake Bay Program come and give us like a history and insights and advice on how to move forward as part of that meeting, and then heard from all these small groups, and then had a meeting about like, well, now what do we do with it all? It was hard, it was a lot, but it was really, really beneficial to our process. So those small groups met, they provided input, and the steering committee then took those as findings to consider. So you see over on the right-hand side, you have the small groups leading to the findings, and that creating source material and going back up to the steering committee. And then where it says ERG, that is an independent contractor who we had started working with in June of last year, who developed questions for evaluation, conducted interviews, read materials, and pulled together their evaluation of that complex partnership, and making what they're calling considerations for the group to use in making a recommendation on the partnership. So all of that goes back to the steering committee. We create a draft, and then after a public input opportunity, present that to the management board and the principal staff committee, and that will be hopefully used to take into the executive council. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Anna. Do you want the papers?
I think I got it. Okay. So with all that background and processes in mind, what are we actually hoping all of this adds up to? So this is the outline of what we would like the product of the Beyond 2025 steering committee to produce. And to help, when you eventually see it, kind of figure out what you're looking at. This is kind of the breakdown of how it's going to work. Fingers crossed. First couple pages. This is the bottom line up front, the critical path forward. These are the high-level recommendations that the steering committee is making on the agreement and the partnership. What do we do moving forward beyond 2025? And how do we convey this to our decision makers within the partnership? And also, what can we say about the vision for the partnership? You've heard words like people, emerging challenges, conservation. What does that tell us about the vision of our partnership moving forward, and how that might have changed since 2014 when it was first put down on paper? After that bottom line up front, you're going to see the second piece, pages 3 through 7 to 10. This is the synthesization of all of the source materials that we've received. It's the connective tissue between that bottom line and everything that we've gathered over the past couple of months. It's going to have those high-level considerations that we've gathered related to science, to restoration and conservation, and to partnership. Those are the 3 building blocks that were included in the Executive Council's charge to us, and so we're delivering our recommendation back to them, kind of broken down the same way that we got it. So it looks familiar and is easy for them to digest. And then after those 2 sections, you're going to see the rest of the source materials, everything that we have collected, either included or incorporated by reference, where they're, the CESA report. It's rather long. We're probably not going to print that all off, but we'll have it incorporated by reference. So that's the outline of the product that we're putting together. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about is, what are we headed towards as far as recommendations? And I'm going to focus on our recommendation, we think, related to the agreement. The recommendation related to partnership is still kind of coming together because, as Martha noted, we just got the interim report from that independent evaluator. So as a steering committee, we need to digest that and get some more feedback before we're able to put that on paper. But we have floated the idea of where we think we're headed when it comes to agreement. So what is the steering committee probably recommending about moving forward when it comes to the agreement? we think we're headed towards an amended agreement, not a brand new process of writing one from scratch, not kind of just leaving the one in place and, you know, continuing without any changes, but looking at what needs to be edited in the current agreement to make sure that it's giving us the direction we need. Why are we saying an amended or updated agreement is the path forward? Well, first, we're making progress under the existing one. It is not fatally flawed. We have done a lot of work, made a lot of change together because it's been in place and guiding us. And so we should recognize that. And we should also recognize that we're not pressing pause at this moment. There's a lot of funding, like the infrastructure bill, that's on the table and available to us now and will disappear in a few years. That's how it's been timed. So it is not time to press pause. It is not time to kind of say we don't know what we're doing. We do know what we're doing, but we know that we can optimize. So this is another way of kind of conveying the work continues. It's amping up even as we continue to think about how do we optimize moving forward. In the materials that we've gathered so far, they do suggest that some changes, some updates to the agreement would help us close that gap between where we are right now and where we ultimately want to be. So since those recommendations or those considerations do suggest a change could do us good, could close that gap, we should make space to have that conversation and pull those updates into the agreement. And then finally, the Watershed Agreement was built for change. Unlike previous agreements where anytime we updated it, we really had to write it fresh and get all of the signatories to sign on to a new document, this agreement, when it was drafted, was specifically created to change with time. There are provisions in it, there are words in it that tell us how that happens. And so we can make use of that and make the agreement do what it needs to do, which is continue to give us guidance, continue to adapt with us as we see these changes coming online. Martha mentioned this before, but the reason why we kind of need to think about what the text of the agreement tells us is because we know 18 outcomes are on course, but many are not. We also know that 11 of these outcomes, roughly 1/3, are tied to 2025 and will not be met in 2025. So we need to think about what do we do after that? What does that goal tell us about what comes after that or that outcome? So these outcomes need to be providing the partnership with guidance moving forward, telling us where we're headed. And in order to do that, we got to take a look at the agreement and make sure those outcomes are giving us that direction. So we're thinking this is going to be a multi-step process. It's not going to be an easy thing to open up a piece of paper or multiple pages that guide a 7-jurisdiction and multi-federal agency partnership. It's going to be a delicate matter to make sure that we're all still linking arms by the end of that process. So the first step is by the next Executive Council meeting. So next year, we're giving ourselves a year. Focus on the high-level updates to everything in that agreement that is above an outcome. That's the vision. That's the preamble, the principles, the goals, and even what it says about how we do management strategies. So over the next year, think about the high-level updates that need to be made to make sure that the agreement's up to date and optimized. Bring these to the Executive Council at the end of next year for their consideration and adoption, so that they are ready to reaffirm their commitment to this partnership moving forward. And we have to fix this language a bit, but over the next 2 years, so beginning in 2025, but continuing into 2026, review, refine, and refresh all of our outcomes. Take a deep look at each of them and make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to do, giving us a time-bound, measurable, target that really makes sense based on the challenges we're facing and the people that we want to benefit. Move through those outdated dates and metrics, use language that reflects those challenges that we're facing, ensure that they are time-bound and measurable. And then as we work through those, move them through the proper decision-making channels. Sometimes that's the principal staff committee, sometimes that's the Executive Council, but figure out who needs to make the decision on moving that forward and present it to the right people at the right time. And this is the timeline to close out the steering committee's process. So July through August, once we get this draft kind of prepared and ready for circulation, it'll go out for public feedback for 2 months, 60 days. And we will be inviting people to give us feedback, and you'll hear more about how you can do that later today. September, we'll take that feedback and we'll be working through revisions as a steering committee. In October, the management board and the principal staff committee will have opportunities to review that product and make a determination about what the executive council should do moving forward. And then in December, when the executive council meets, it'll be up to them to take action to direct the partnership forward based on the recommendations that they've received. So I will stop there. I'm looking forward to your comments as we move into breakouts, but hopefully that gives you some sense of where we think we're headed.
We are going to take the opportunity to just kind of check in with the group here. Folks used Mentimeter before? Some people that are familiar with it, maybe? Okay. So if you're not, essentially, our good friend Logan back there is going to pull up a screen for you. This is a way to get real-time feedback. It's actually a really cool tool. So you can use this QR code from your phone. Just scan it and then press the little link that'll pop up. Or you can go to the website right there and enter in the code. And it'll take you right to the Mentimeter. All right, I'll give you guys a moment. And Laura's gonna kind of facilitate through this a little bit. But we're gonna ask a series of questions, a couple of fun ones, get a sense of who's in the room, and then we'll just do a little bit of feedback and initial reaction to sort of what we heard from the panel and what we just heard from the presentation. We'll take a little break so everyone can digest that a little bit, and then we'll come back and do the breakout. So I'll bring Laura back up to the stage.
All right, hopefully you guys are looking at options on your devices. And the first question is, what's your favorite critter that calls the Chesapeake Bay Watershed home? And as everything pops up on the screen, like this is the word cloud system, where the more a particular answer is entered, the larger it will appear. Osprey is holding the center. Wow. I saw humans in there. Salamanders. I think I saw my kids, but it's moving, so I can't tell. Hellbenders, one of my favorites. I have not seen one yet in the wild. I really want to. Great blue heron, catfish, river otter, horseshoe crabs. That's one of my favorite too. Dolphins, increasingly so. How many responses? I guess we'll know when it sort of stabilizes. Is that how we know? Okay, all right. We're up to 132. I guess we will move on from there. Let's see the next question, please. Where do you call home? Where did you, what home base did you come from to join us today? Let's see. Maryland, looks like Maryland, whoop, it's taken a little while. Which makes sense, being in Maryland, right, that might be the darkest cluster. See one in Delaware, one West Virginia, one other. All right, very good. Let's go ahead to the next question. Oh, here, again, questions about you. What type of organization do you represent? Let me see, academia, business, federal agents, state agencies, local government, nonprofits, or other. I'm really curious what other is. The nonprofits are well represented today. That's terrific. Very good. Is it? All right, let's go ahead to the next one. What's the first, oh, it's getting tougher now, guys. This is going to depend on whether you paid attention to the last presentation. What's the first word that comes to mind in reaction to the recommendations from the Beyond 2025 Steering Committee? So kind of a gut reaction to what Martha and Anna shared with you. Daunting. Let's see. I know you might need a few minutes to think about this one, right? I think I saw both broad and vague. depends on your perspective. Complex, I see too slow. People is holding pretty large in the middle. Opportunity, without a doubt. Yeah, I would agree with that one. Time, interesting. Long term. What else? 100, I'm going to wait for a few more responses on this one. Oh, it's getting harder to read. Need prayer. Needs more people focus. That's not one word, but I think everyone kind of bended that rule. You see something about young people on there, which is interesting. Cautious optimism, collaboration, another young people, measurable, complexity. All right, we're up to 162. That's a lot of food for thought there. Let's go ahead to the next one. All right, this is on a sliding scale. I am pleased with the Beyond 2025 Steering Committee recommendations. From what you've heard so far, we know there's a lot more to learn and a lot of questions to be asked. How does it feel to amend the current agreement, probably settling on the high-level language, visioning, and goals over the course of the next year, while work on the more specific outcomes starts in the next year and continues in 2026? All right, looks like we've had maybe maybe a little more than half the folks respond so far. All right, we're hanging at 5.9. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next one. Do the Beyond 2025 Steering Committee recommendations go fast enough? How do you feel about the time frame of what's being recommended? And again, that would be carrying those recommendations to the Executive Council later this year, with work to start in 2025 and continue into 2026 on the specifics. Looks like on this one we're leaning a little towards the too slow side of the scale. Let's see. Am I reading the symbols in the lower corner here? Those are the number of responses? Okay. So we're at about 70. There might be, I don't know, there's a fair number more that could weigh in, but maybe you're not sure yet. All right, we'll say that's hanging at around the 3.2 mark. Let's go ahead to the next one. All right, try to keep it to one word. We can't do paragraphs here, but what is missing from the recommendations that you would like to see? Is there anything that you want to see have more emphasis? Oh, look at this. I'm seeing young people again. Structure, principles, action, workforce, education, ecosystem services, accountability, DEI, innovation, climate change, consensus, urgency. There's another innovation, another jobs being mentioned, human needs, bold climate action, more workforce, education, accountability. Oh, I see that in more than one spot. Good. All right, we'll go ahead to the next one. We're looking for secret sauce, I think. In one word, what does the Chesapeake Bay Program partnership need to succeed? Funding is holding the center position. Accountability, commitment, workforce was up there pretty large a minute ago. Collaboration and leadership. Intersectionality, points for that one. That's probably has the most syllables at least. Leadership, better representation, structural overhaul, resiliency. I also saw grassroots in there, it moved, but Market support. Interesting. Okay. All right. Is there another one? I think we're getting towards the end. In one word, what do you see as the main reason that we have not achieved all of our restoration goals? Do you think there is an underlying theme that's holding a lot of us up? Turf, politics, accountability, disinvestment, population growth, laziness, lack of political will, bureaucracy, complexity, stressors, all playing a role. Increased crop yields. Well, it keeps moving. Lack of champions, I think I saw. Culture, tunnel vision, overworking. Local zoning, lack of buy-in. Did I see paperwork up there? It moved, but I think that's what I saw. All right. Profits over nature. Look at that. All right. Accountability, politics, profits, funding all seem to be taking the center there. Very good. I think that might be the last one. That is the last one. Okay. Do we have?
All right. So I think we're going to get the slides that folks took notes on up on the screen, but I know there are a couple groups that didn't have a chance to use the slides, so I might start with them first since we're going to take a second to get that up. And I think one of them is public access. Sorry, Pam. So we'll have our report out from the public access group first. Pam, did you want to come up here? Do you want me to bring you? Either one, whatever you're more comfortable with. How are the breakouts? Did people have good discussion? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, great. Here you go. You can come up here if you want, or you can go down here, wherever you like.
Hey everybody, so we looked at public access, and the first thing we did was looked at the fact that there was only one outcome, and it seemed to really highlight boat ramps, and we thought there must be a little more to that, especially after hearing from Mariah Davis today about how access really needs to be expanded for everyone. So some of the recommendations we have is, one, they need more outcomes. Two, they should do an analysis of existing public access sites, because we don't want it to just be a number. We got 300, we're done. So what are these sites, and who is the access for? Is it just for boaters? It's just for wealthy white people, or is it for other people? What other kind of access can we have, and how can we make it more welcoming? What are the barriers? Is it language? Is it transportation? One person at our table said he did not know how close the Anacostia River was, or it was a park for him, until he went there with his school. So we think that we need to look at the existing public access sites, see how they're used, what are the barriers. Let's expand what public access means. Could it be picnicking? Could it be a pocket park? What else could it be? And then what are the barriers for some of the municipalities and places where they have public access? Some folks said there's a really beautiful river, but swimming's not allowed because the municipalities are afraid of litigation. So what can we do about that? And so we feel like we need to add more outcomes. We need to do an analysis of existing sites. We need to see where the holes are, and then we need to invite people in to where they do not know about access or have access, and whether that's transportation, signage, people who speak their language, or just a seat at the table. And I'll share my notes with you later.
Awesome, thank you. Good job, public access. Woo, yes, round of applause. Awesome, awesome. And we got the slides up now. Okay, great. Sustainable fisheries, I believe, was over here. I will walk to you. You don't have to come up on stage if you don't want to. Whatever you'd like. It was a high-level overview, but we'll just scroll through the slides slowly so people can read.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name's Allison Colden. I'm with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and we had a very distinguished group over here discussing sustainable fisheries. Our reaction to the goal is we are not yet done. So there are parts of the sustainable fisheries goal that are yet to be achieved. Specifically, crabs are still, oysters are great. We've talked a lot about oysters so far, but there's still more work. We noted in general that, at the goal level, which is somewhat to be expected but could be improved, there are some vague words or language that aren't necessarily, used a lot in the context of fisheries. So one that came up was enhanced. Like, what does that mean with respect to fisheries? It's a very broad-reaching goal, and a lot of it is not exactly related to the living resources, which are spelled out in the outcomes. So, for example, it talks a lot about habitat, and it talks a lot about ecological connections amongst species, and not a lot of that is necessarily captured in those outcomes. But we do think that there needs to be additional emphasis on those ecological relationships, ecosystem-based management, and a better connection to the vital habitats goals, which are so critically important for these species. Some of the changes we thought might be an improvement to the goal are, again, cross-cutting more between, between the vital habitats goals and the fisheries goals that reflect the needs of the living resources and help us get to some of the broad-reaching goals that are there. Again, we noted that this is one of those parts of the agreement that is voluntary, not regulatory, and so how do we incentivize some of the actions that are needed, including the types of funding that are needed to implement those outcomes and goals. So moving on to the outcomes, thank you. We had outcomes related to blue crab management, forage fish, fish habitat, and oysters, or what make up our sustainable fisheries outcomes. Again, stable and productive. How is that measured? So is this productive relative to the fishery and the livelihoods of the watermen who are fishing for blue crabs? This one's from the crab outcome in particular. Or does that relate to the population of the blue crabs themselves? There's several of these outcomes that talk about continuous improvement. While that signals that this has no beginning or end necessarily, it also means that it's very hard to measure progress. And so there might need to be some interim tangible goals that we can measure that forward progress on. Our forage fish outcome was not necessarily something we felt was actionable. It was about understanding the role of forage fish in the Chesapeake Bay, which several of us thought was pretty obvious at the time, although noting that the reference to capacity may also reflect the need to apply resources to unmanaged species. So species that don't get a lot of management attention because they are unmanaged species. And so changes, we thought that 2026 for these outcomes in particular was too slow because many of them are either completed or are likely to be completed by the 2025 deadline, leaving kind of a sustainable fisheries in a lurch if we don't have some guidance on what these look like moving forward. We have a new stock assessment coming for blue crabs, so that should be updated with the best available science once that is available. Again, fish habitat and forage, making those actionable, reflecting that forage right now is limited to just fish, but there are several other types of species which are really important: small crustaceans, worms, clams, and specifically to oysters, since we've had so much conversation about how well they're doing so far. We got 30 more. That was a suggestion to restore 30 more tributaries. Again, ambitious aspirational goals going on here, but also the importance of maintaining the existing work that's happened. So understanding that we have spent a lot of time and energy and funding on those oyster projects to date, and we should go ahead and protect what we've done there. So lastly, any additional outcomes missing? Striped bass, it was a take it or leave it. We had some other things that made that a little challenging, particularly that's a species that's managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, so don't know how much agency there is there. Alocines, particularly menhaden, invasive species, so we did talk about how the Bay Program stood up an invasive catfish task force, so maybe that comes along in some way, but it doesn't currently have an outcome associated with it. And then lastly, just a question of whether or not there's a role for oyster aquaculture, either as a separate outcome or part of whatever goal comes next related to oysters. Thanks.
I'm going to personally advocate for the worm outcome for the Chesapeake Bay program. So, all right. So the second one, I don't know why I moved because you guys are all over there. Oh, and Lori got a microphone.
Drew got me.
Awesome.
So our table talked about vital habitats, and there's a couple of the goals that really kind of spread across all, they mesh across all of the goals, and this is one of them. So as you can see, the language around the first goal, we actually had some questions around it. It is somewhat broad and specific at the same time. It's written to gain support from an unknown audience. I think we are trying to figure out the language that's used. Is it used for regulators? Or is the language for the general public? Trying to understand that and be more clear the next time it's updated about who it's written for. And if it's written for the general public, we might need to change some of that language. Just around what changes need to happen. Again, like we heard from a lot of our panelists earlier today, include some people-focused outcomes and language around in the goals. Habitats are there not only to protect vital species, but they're there for people to enjoy. We have a whole our goal on access, so we should be able to talk about the synergy between all of the goals, and this is one of the examples. And again, be more explicit around how people enjoy ecosystem, or people enjoy habitats, and habitats create ecosystem services writ large. Public health is not mentioned in this document, I don't think, at all, and it's important that we put it somewhere, so we're raising our hand. So we wanted to talk about that, and then add more language around climate resiliency. Our habitats built for today's climate are going to be very different than the ones we need to build for 20, 50 years from now. So we have to pay attention to that when we develop our outcomes, and make sure they're there for future generations. We have a lot of outcomes, 8, 10, I can't remember. No, it was good. And only 2 of them are on course, so that's fascinating. I'm going to read them out real quick, just so you have an understanding. So black ducks, brook trout, fish passage, forest buffers, stream health, SAVs, tree canopy, and wetlands. Most of them are not on course to be met by 2025. So some are working, a couple are working, and some are not. We have to understand why some aren't on track, and understand why some are. And for those that are, kind of build on that success. Either they wrote the goal, with the right language, or however it kind of came to fruition. But make sure that we replicate that model when we move forward. And then for those that aren't working, what's in the way? And make sure we address that next time we update this language. And we learned that sometimes it depends on how these outcomes were written. Some are actually outputs, and some are outcomes, so we want to make that consistent. For example, I think the oyster goal talks about how many oysters we put into the bay, not how many oysters are living in the bay, because we're not taking to effect what's being taken out of the bay. Same thing for forest canopy and some of the other goals. We don't account for what we're losing when we talk about these outcomes. And then changes, again, make them consistent. We should make our outcomes consistent across the board, but particularly within the same goal, and that would be nice. And we need to save what we have. We're talking about large population growth, so we need to save what we have and focus on high quality areas and corridors and important habitats that we can kind of maintain in the best way, not just randomly, picking this acre here and this acre there, because we can. And then protect. We need to protect more than we restore, just because of the extensive development that's happening in our watershed, we do have to focus more on protection, I think. Yeah, last one. Oh, we got a big vote for adding vernal pools to our long list, and particularly paying attention to habitat corridors next time around.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Good job. All right, water quality. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Wherever you're the most comfortable. We're all friends here. We've been here for 3 hours. We're all good.
Hello. So we talked about, first and foremost, obviously the goal, and I think there everybody's pretty happy. We had, not a ton of discussion. The wording felt just about right. How to distill that into a sentence is difficult, and I think they got it just about right. There was a little bit of discussion about the word tributaries and whether or not in some jurisdictions, especially the headwaters jurisdictions, you want to be a little more inclusive, rivers and streams or waters, or just say the whole watershed. But otherwise, the goal itself felt pretty good. The first outcome was interesting because the 2017 target, reducing 60% of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment by 2017, is obviously wholly passed, but it's still worthwhile to discuss an interim goal, even if it's not yet attained. So there was some discussion of keeping it and obviously changing the date. The second outcome was the 2025 target. There was pretty good discussion about maybe changing up the entire metrics. So one proposal was, rather than using this model-based approach and reducing nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment by a certain percentage by a certain date, you focus on shallow waters more generally and say, let's try and get, say, 60% of tributaries trending in the right direction by a certain date. So that was one proposal, and some good discussion around that. And then following from that, you could have an interim and a final target, so 60% of tributaries or water bodies with a monitoring station attached to it, trending in the right direction by a certain date, and then maybe a final date later on would be a second outcome. Third was on the water quality standards attainment, and there was a lot of consensus that we need more funding for more monitoring, particularly as discussion has focused on maybe switching more in terms of accountability framework from a model-based to a monitoring-based approach. You're going to need more funding for monitoring stations, obviously. There's some good discussion about how to expand the acceptance of citizen monitoring data, but then also for the broader public, how do we communicate the results of the monitoring efforts? I think that was as far as we got, which, yeah, that's moderator error.
You're good.
Yeah. So,
We didn't give you an easy one.
yeah. But that's it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, water quality. All right. Group 4, I think, is over in this general direction. Toxics, also not an easy topic.
Hi,
can do it,
everybody. Okay, I was wanted to offer the group, but I'm Maria Russo with West Virginia Rivers Coalition. We had the toxic contaminants topic. So we talked about our goal. When we looked at it, we felt like it was very ambitious and far-reaching. There was language used such as free of effects from toxic contaminants, and we didn't really know what that meant or how we would get there. So we felt like that was really a moving target and pretty unattainable with this being such a huge topic. But like another group mentioned, we also talked about how the goal was broad, but then our outcomes were very specific. So they only mentioned PCBs and mercury, and then just kind of had this category of other contaminants. And we didn't really feel like that captured the full breadth of the topic. And so one of our thoughts was that, there was really no definition here. And that was one of the things we discussed as really being a necessary change. So we felt like there also could be some measurable benchmarks here. And our question that we were left with is, how do we make it broad enough to catch all the huge category that is emerging contaminants, but narrow enough to have measurable outcomes? And we can go to the next slide. So then when we looked at the specific outcomes, there was a research outcome, and then there was a policy and prevention outcome. And the research, outcome mentioned, again, PCBs and mercury references, but that felt very narrow and dated. Like the conversation was kind of left where it might have been years ago, and we didn't really feel like there was an option to have that evolve as we gather more information. So we talked about needing to really have more of a prioritization of risks across contaminants, and a better way to communicate those high risk or low risk levels to various communities. We also felt like some changes that we needed was a clear baseline. So where are we starting with those research goals, and therefore how can we make our policies or preventative measures more adaptive over time? And again, just more concrete information about how, from that baseline, how can we actually improve? And another topic we talked about is really more explicitly acknowledging communities. We did not feel like people who are impacted by these contaminants were mentioned at all in the goals or the outcomes specifically. And so some of the things we thought were missing, we thought the fish consumption advisories could be a good tool to help capture some of this. We also talked about being able to address community concerns and making sure we're inviting most impacted communities into the conversation so that it's a dialogue. And our question was, are there any public health agencies? I know a couple other groups mentioned that, like, where does public health fall in all of this, and can we make it more of a priority? And that we really, again, like I stated, wanted a better prioritization of which contaminants we're really talking about, and how we can approach this also as a large and growing topic in the Bay.
Thank you, Toxics. I don't know if you really say that on a real basis, but all right. Land conservation and healthy watershed. This was two that were merged together. Our very own Sarah Ramotnik has the report out.
Okay, it works. Great. Okay, hi everybody, I'm Sarah with the Coalition, and yes, we had two topics, land conservation and healthy watersheds. I'll be honest, we spent more time on land conservation because we had a group that was very large and very passionate about land conservation, so we tried our best. They're a little messy, I'm sorry. So with reaction to the goals, with land conservation, we are very close to our goal. We're on track to meet it. That's great. But the question is, what happens afterwards? What's our next step with that? And you have to continue on with the goals to maintain, and not just to maintain, but to grow. And so you need to have that goal increase over time. We talked about how important funding and resources are, and you need more of those to conserve more lands. For changes, we thought it was important to note that permanent protection adds value on top of in-place best management practices, and this value should be emphasized, perhaps in the model. We wanted to make the carrots go farther. I know Ben is a big stick versus carrot guy, so we definitely talked about that. And so yes, we want to make the carrots go farther. Land conservation is voluntary, so you can't have as many sticks with that, if any. So definitely want to have more carrots there in our vegetable drawer. We think there should be a 30 by 30 goal, just like the Biden administration has. And we also talked at one point about having these goals as kind of interim goals, right? Like there's this big narrative right now with, 2025, and it sometimes seems like the be all end all, and maybe just breaking it down a little bit and looking at these like, okay, we reached this step, and then we reach this step, and then from there we keep going. And so maybe having that 30 by 30 goal be for now, and then 50 by 50, just like E.O. Wilson's Half Earth. Again, that's already been established in the Biden administration, but not in the Watershed Agreement. Something else we talked about is bringing more diverse voices to the table. We need new tools that are more inclusive. Land trusts should be able to get resources to community-led conservation efforts to make sure that they are getting what they need to preserve the lands that they want to protect, their cultural sites, et cetera. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so for the outcomes, the healthy watersheds outcome, there was only one. There's been no change in progress since April 2018, and the outlook is uncertain. That's because they can't track this. So it'd be really great to get things in place where metrics in place where you can track that outcome. For the land conservation outcomes, there were 3 of them. All are on course to be met, which is really great to hear. Yeah, let me see. Okay. We talked about flexibility, the rate of change, especially with emerging threats such as solar siting, data centers. We talked about that some. Those things are happening, and like Kristen was saying earlier, the 2014 agreement didn't take into consideration some of these different emerging issues, and so we need to be able to be flexible as they arise. And so the rate of change is faster than the models being updated, and therefore the rate of change is faster than our methods for decision making. And we need these tools for decision making. They're really important. Next slide. Thank you. So this is kind of just a big mash of things. One thing that kept coming up over and over again is we need these goals to translate down to the local level. Local zoning is so important. Comprehensive planning, when it comes to this sort of stuff, land use. So we need to make sure that you have these upper level goals, and then you also bring them down to the county level, municipality level, et cetera. We also need to protect our cultural sites. That was something that was really important to our group. The first outcome for the land conservation goal set a goal of 2 million acres, an additional 2 million acres being conserved. And again, we're on track to meet that, but we're looking at some interim goals in the future because that was, you could call it an interim goal for now. And we already talked about switching that narrative for more interim goals and moving on from there. Yeah, I think that's it.
Is that it? Awesome. Thank you, Land Conservation and Healthy Watershed. Woo. So I got to step in, I had the honor of stepping in for Group 7. We already did public access, so we're good. Thank you. For environmental literacy and stewardship, which I'm no expert in, so thank you for welcoming me to your table to try and take notes. So it was interesting because we had a lot of conversation. I'm hearing things that are over here about goals being too broad. So we definitely felt like that around the stewardship goal. But with environmental literacy, we started getting into a discussion about how we feel like it might be too narrow, which is actually really interesting. Changes that need to happen, thinking with your stewardship, how is marketing playing into this? Communication, social marketing, right? Behavior change, really leaning into that. I know that's been a big part of the stewardship work group at the Bay Program in the past, but really thinking how we can integrate that into our work. I don't think Casey Wessler or anyone else in social marketing is in the room right now, but they would be applauding that. And how are we building the capacity for stewardship? And are we breaking down barriers? Are we thinking about this from a DEIJ perspective and ensuring that we are changing the barriers to access, barriers to participation, and how is that being included in some of these goals and outcomes? Really, so when we talked about being environmental literacy being too narrow, really interesting conversation around should environmental literacy stop at K through 12? When do we really stop learning? When does environmental literacy end? And so how can we think about the next iteration of this? So next slide. And so again, is there any current way we are measuring how, and that's one of the issues I think with the stewardship goal is our outcome is how we're measuring progress on that. So is there a way to kind of utilize an inventory of current citizen science opportunities? Are there opportunities through grant reporting, or an app was something that was brought up? So just some ideas on how we can measure our progress on that. Talked a lot about collaboration across organizations. If one organization isn't, the right organization to provide that type of stewardship, how are we connecting with others? And again, broadening beyond K through 12 in our environmental literacy, and also a goal related to how we're thinking about language when it comes to inclusion and some of that work. So again, we actually had a really interesting conversation, and I kind of posed the question, should these two be merged? Let's be bold. We didn't come to a decision on that. We kind of were like, maybe you guys can talk about that yourselves over the next year and a half. But I really liked this from, I think Laura was the one that said this at our table. These two are sisters, but not twins. They're related. They have a lot of overlap. We started talking about public access at one point when we were talking about stewardship and environmental literacy. So breaking down some of those silos and barriers. And then with environmental literacy, thinking about how we're increasing environmental literacy an adult, like outside of the K through 12 sphere, talking about that generational barrier that exists where people that didn't have MeWes didn't have that opportunity to go out and experience the world. So adult field trips, things like the Watershed Steward Academies, how are we thinking about that in the future for environmental literacy? So did you okay, group 7, is that all right? Okay, good. All right, yay for group 7. That's it. All right, climate resiliency is Rosa over here.
Hey everyone, can you hear me? Great. I had the pleasure of leading the climate resiliency group, and we had a very lively group. Again, my name is Rosa Hans. I'm the energy policy contractor for Choose Clean Water. And we had a really lively discussion about the goal itself. I feel like there might have, well, that's all right. I think we updated it since it's on the slide, but our one-word reactions to the climate resiliency goal is that it's outdated. It still kind of has that may feeling, is climate change, right? That overall impression, was very quickly decided to be a little bit out of date. I think we can all recognize that conditions are changing. And that reality should be reflected not only in the preamble, in the goal, throughout the entire agreement itself. And we even got into a little bit of discussion on some of the other goals and outcomes that could use a little bit of a climate refresh, right? A quick highlight, the stewardship group, we talked about climate. I noticed one of the other groups brought it up themselves. So I think everyone in the room was noticing it, was feeling it, and so just wanted to make sure to name that at the start. So overall, the kinds of changes that we were discussing seeing in the climate resiliency goal, yeah, all of my spell check things had been.
There's no judgment.
Sorry. Overall, folks wanted to see the language be more proactive, not just providing resiliency, but also talking about mitigation, and nature-based solutions being part of that mitigation also provides resiliency. So kind of doing it all, being a little bit more inclusive, and overall we thought the wording and phrasing of this goal was stronger than the outcomes, which we'll get to in just a second. It has a good foundation, but definitely needs a refresh. A couple of, there's just a bunch of things that aren't quite built into the goal, and overall needing a lot more urgency. So next. Okay, under monitoring and the monitoring outcome and the adaptation outcome. So we only have two outcomes in the climate resiliency area. For the monitoring, the biggest thing that we discussed was that there's kind of we're going to continue to watch what's happening as it's happening. And there is consensus among the group that we need to use the projections that exist out there in the scientific community to make decisions in a forward-thinking way about our future, and assess communities and localities that are vulnerable to climate change, create priorities, and make sure that communities are engaged in that monitoring assessment process, because these are their homes, their backyards, and this is a lived reality. On the adaptation outcome, again, we felt like the language needs to be a little bit sharper, more measurable. The use of continual was, it needs metrics involved, and we also noted that there's a heavy reliance on the coastal elements in the climate resiliency adaptation outcome. And the coasts are not the only places that are experiencing these heavy storms, excessive flooding, and so we can actually, we don't have to focus on coast is important, but it's not just the coast that will be flooding. That will be everywhere. And we thought that if there was a place, in the outcomes to specifically call out nature-based solutions, that the adaptation outcome would be the best place for that. because those are the kinds of solutions we want to make it really clear that, built infrastructure is not necessarily the most resilient infrastructure. Sometimes nature has the best solutions for the dramatic, evolving conditions that we're facing. I think next. And then, are there outcomes missing from this goal? Yes, short answer. Slightly longer answer. One, we need a mitigation outcome. Appreciate adaptation and resilience, but mitigation, reducing harms, reducing risks, that absolutely has to be a part of the future amendments that we're discussing earlier. And we flagged that there weren't regulatory or policy recommendations within here, just kind of calling that out. And that there was a bunch of funding opportunities within the climate, and we discussed this in the earlier session, that there's going to be opportunities for funding that won't last forever. So now is a great time to make sure we're incorporating that into bay restoration efforts. And yeah, like I said, we're kind of including climate references or climate smart policies throughout the agreement.
Great. Thank you, climate. I'm too I don't know. And then we had a DIJ group. I think Julie, there's Julia, all the way over there. Oh, here, Rosa, you can pass it off to Julia. Oh, there we go. There's.
I'm going to go in the corner so I can see all of you. Hi, y'all. I didn't really think that these would be in front of you, so the notes might not be particularly
Again, there's no
coherent.
judgment here. We're all family.
So we took a little bit of a different approach because of what DEIJ is. We do have a DEIJ outcome, but we were thinking a little bit bigger picture than the individual outcome. And we actually started with a discussion of the principles, because the principles include a couple of things that are really important to DEIJ. So representing the interests of people, operating with transparency, engaging citizens, people, using social science, promoting environmental justice. So all of those things are already built into the agreement. We're talking about, is that an effective place for them to be built into the agreement? What are they doing in the principles as opposed to in other parts of the agreement? And while that's really valuable, what impact have they had from within the principles? And do the principles, what they are, need to be changed for those things in them to have a greater impact on the rest of the agreement? So we had a little bit of a discussion about that. One of our, not huge answers, but one of our thoughts was that the principles are really process-based. And DEIJ is very process-based. And a lot of the things that we are talking about when we talk about DEIJ, we're looking at equity in our processes. So that was kind of the beginning of our discussion. And then we wanted to look at incorporating DEIJ into one of the goals and outcomes that was a little bit more obvious. So we talked about stewardship, and then one where it's not as obvious. So we looked at water quality. I'm going to talk about these in the opposite order. So in terms of stewardship, we were thinking about how there's a lot of different ways of being a steward. The goal and outcome call out volunteering specifically. We talked about how volunteering is a privilege, and how the outcome specifically talks about using trained volunteers, and how that is not equitable. And it doesn't account for inclusiveness. It talks specifically about increasing the number of people, but doesn't account for meaningful inclusion. And then we had a large discussion on incorporating what people do in their day-to-day as stewards. So their existing activities, and making sure that that we provide resources for those as opposed to telling them how to be a volunteer. And then, I'm just looking at my notes. One of the key things that we were talking about in terms of stewardship was making sure that all of our opportunities are additive as opposed to extractive. The language in that goal and outcome is a little bit extractive. And we want to make sure that we are providing resources, that we are equipping communities to advocate for themselves, and that we're shifting the emphasis to work that's already being done by these communities. All right. And then we moved on to water quality, which we're a group of partnership-focused people, and it kind of emphasized how much we need to work together with all of the water quality folks to incorporate DEIJ into those goals where it's not super obvious. So the first thing that we started with was making sure that EJ communities are targeted in terms of addressing our pollutants. So focusing attainment on our highest areas of need where there is not sufficient resources already. And then we had that kind of continuous discussion that we've had a lot of times about humans as living resources and as an indicator species. And then one of the other things that we talked a little bit more about was incorporating DEIJ into permits and into regulation. So incorporating it, what would it look like if it was inside of our TMDLs and our WIPs, as opposed to us asking people to put it into their projects. So taking the burden onto the regulatory agencies as opposed to the state agencies or the local agencies. And honestly, that's a very surface level of how you could incorporate water quality. I think the conversation really emphasized, how you could incorporate DEIJ into water quality. It emphasized the need for us to all come together and talk more about this. I think that's kind of it. Does anybody else want to add? Yeah, we also talked a lot about monitoring and where the gaps in monitoring. So where do we need to increase monitoring without creating a burden on EJ communities?
Good job work, DIJ group.
Thank you.
Yay, that's all the groups. Applause for everybody, hand on the back. I wish I had a Menti meter because it would be really interesting to hear folks' thoughts on some of the cross-cutting issues. And I'm making up time here anyway, but it seemed like there were a lot of cross conversations, like breaking down silos between these different goals. I heard a lot about people. I heard a lot about climate. I heard a lot about public health, or a lot about DIJ amongst a lot of the different groups. So a lot, definitely climate, different intersecting, issues there. So something to think about and food for thought. And this is just the beginning, because we are starting this public engagement, this public feedback right now, but it is just really getting started, and it's going to really get going into the end of next year and through next year and beyond, as we were just seeing. So to help us think through how we can do our public engagement very well, I'm going to welcome Rachel Felver up to the stage to talk a little bit about the public engagement strategy for all of this. You can do whatever you want. You be comfortable.
All right, hi everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Felver. I'm the Communications Director at the Chesapeake Bay Program with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. So how am I involved in this whole process? Well, Kristen Riley and I have partnered together on creating an engagement and public feedback strategy for all of this work. So for these months now, May and June, we are here to provide all the knowledge we can, answer your questions, take in all of the information that you're sharing for this entire process. As our end goals, we want to make sure that you are appropriately prepared to comment on the draft when it becomes available. And I know, as Anna said, that this is happening right now. There's a drafting team, so this is going to be out soon. Just so you all know, it will be posted on July 1st. There will be a 60-day public feedback period. So encourage as many folks we want all of your feedback, essentially. And that is going to be taken and considered and prepared to be put into a second draft that will eventually be what goes to the Principal Staff Committee and the Executive Council at the end of this year. So pay attention to our website, chesapeakebay.net. There will be emails that go out when it's posted. We will accept comments through our email address, which is comments@chesapeakebay.net. In the meantime, our steering committee has done a great job with going out there and talking to different groups, going to different meetings. So if there's anything else that you're aware of that's coming up and you think that this would be a great topic for people to know more about, send me a note, send Kristen a note, and we'll make sure to get folks engaged with that. And I know I'm standing in the way of happy hour, so I will just leave it at that.
Oh, Now you're putting the pressure on me. Actually, Drew's the last speaker, so he's the one that's standing in between you and the bar right there. All right. And just building off of public engagement, obviously this was part of the public engagement strategy for Beyond 2025. As a coalition, as Choose Clean Water, we are regularly sending sign-on letters and feedback, whether it's solicited or not. And so we will be sending a comment letter on the recommendations from the Beyond 2025 Steering Committee. Our steering committee had a meeting this morning where we approved our letter. So that will be coming out for sign-on the first week of June. Chesapeake Bay Awareness Week, very, very timely and very good time to be putting out some advocacy work. So we'll be sending out information about a webinar on June 3rd at 10 a.m. I think that's right, Drew. And we'll go through the coalition's recommendations and our letter and our asks. We'll, at that point, have the sign-on letter open to our coalition members to sign on. If you're an NGO that is not a coalition member, feel free to become a coalition member. You can sign on to our letter. And we'll talk a little bit about the work that you all can do, whether a coalition member or not, over the summer to participate in that public engagement process. Anyone is welcome to submit comments, I believe, to that public engagement process. So anyone, as an individual, as your organization, and we encourage folks to do that because this is a partnership. You know, it is within the NGO community, within academia, within businesses, within federal and state agencies and everything. So definitely want to encourage folks to give as much feedback as they can. So all right, we made it. It's almost 5 p.m. How did we do? Did I get us back on track? Look at that, 4:47. All right, so we're doing great. So I just wanted to thank some folks before I turn it over to Drew. I really want to thank the folks that helped set the tone this morning, Martha, Jill, Kristen, and Mariah for grounding our discussion. We'll pause there. Anna, for your leadership and presentation, and especially on the Beyond 2025 Steering Committee. A little pause there. For everyone, all the breakouts that helped everyone, Allison, Laura, Evan, Maria, Sarah, Pam, Amy, Rosa, Julie, and Julia. Thank you all for moderating the breakouts. I know I emailed you guys like 2 weeks ago to do that, so thank you for doing that. Rachel, obviously, for your efforts on public engagement. It's been great working with you on that. And then, of course, Laura for facilitating and leading us all through the first half of today. Thank you so much for that. I know sometimes when we have these discussions, it can kind of feel like, well, we just really scratched the surface, and there's so much to be done, and I don't feel like I don't know what we really got out of today, but I'm telling you, all of what you're thinking, if that's what you're thinking, is true. We really did just scratch the surface today. This could have been a whole day meeting and you all would have killed me. So I think that just is something to say that our work is just starting, right? While it's already started, it really is just kicking off today. And I think we laid a really great foundation for the next several months, into the next several years as we work together on this. So I was not surprised by the creativity and innovation that came out of the small group discussions, the feedback that we received from the Mentimeter, and I just really want to thank you all so much for taking 3.5 hours out of your day to participate in this. I think stakeholder engagement and feedback is so important, and so just thank you for doing that. But I invite everyone to take a moment to relax, and we'll celebrate the wins that we have had, which are great. It's awesome to celebrate. Breathe, because the hard work is coming, and we're going to be ready for it. So with that, I will turn it over to Drew for some housekeeping.
I promise I'll be fast. First of all, one other thank you is there was a generous anonymous donor that made the first 150 spots for this possible today. So thank you. You know who you are. It was me. Just kidding. So I know it's been a long, productive afternoon. Don't want to stay keep you away from the drinks, so I'll be quick. For those staying at Turf Valley, check-in is available now. It started at 4, so you can go check in whenever you're ready. We will reconvene here tomorrow at 9 o'clock. We're going to try to get started on time, but the breakfast is available from 8 to 9, so don't miss breakfast. And last but not least, I told you I'd be fast. Please check out our silent auction. Right outside these doors, you can see there's some really great outdoorsy packages. We can bid on a kayak package, canoes, tents, camping chairs, lots of great stuff, all which supports the coalition and our work for clean water. And we only have one bid so far, so you're here now, and it's the first day. You can get in on the ground floor and set the tone. So please start bidding. There's QR codes out there. It's all online, super easy and straightforward to do. But if you have any questions, talk to any of the coalition staff. And with that, please go let your hair down, have some fun.